My name is Tom Blackson, and this is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach, PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. Last time we saw what Thales and his fellow Malaysians did. They were inquirers into nature. We saw, too, that by the time of Socrates, if not before, this inquiry was understood to be a search for wisdom. The question now is how, by engaging in a search for wisdom, did Thales cause a philosophical tradition to come into existence? When we ask this, we have to keep in mind that the Greek word that sounds like our word philosophy means love of wisdom. So the question is how, by engaging in a search for wisdom, did Thales and the Malaysians cause what turned into a 1,000-year conversation about wisdom? When the question is understood in this way, the answer is pretty clear. It is that what the Malaysians were doing was perplexing. It was not very clear what wisdom is and whether the Malaysians were engaging in the right kind of thinking to produce wisdom. This started a conversation in which answers were posed to these questions. We can see part of this conversation in what survives of what Parmenides wrote. He was born in the second half of the 5th century BCE, and this puts him within Socrates' lifetime and about 50 years after the solar eclipse in 585 that Thales predicted. Parmenides draws a distinction between two kinds of thinking, reason and experience, in connection with an argument he gives for the conclusion that reality is changeless. Let's go over here to Parmenides. Here we go. Now, we ordinarily think that things come into and eventually will go out of existence. So we're not inclined, at least initially, to accept Parmenides' conclusion. He thinks that our ordinary belief is false, but he doesn't just argue that this belief is false. He also explains why we think, right, it's true, why we think the proposition is true, that things do come into and go out of existence. It's in this explanation that he introduces his distinction between two kinds of thinking, reason and experience. He thinks that we get our belief that things come into and go out of existence from experience, but that if we want to know the truth, we need to use reason to form our beliefs. He thinks that when we do this, we see that the assumption that something comes into or goes out of existence leads to a contradiction. Let's take a look at some of what Parmenides wrote. Here's part of Parmenides wrote a poem. That's what survived. It's in verse. So he unlike the Malaysians, sticks with the traditional style that we've already seen in Hesiod and the Theologists. He doesn't write in prose. The translation here just preserves the distinction between metrical lines, nothing else. And what we have here is what survived in a poem he wrote, in which he argues that coming into and going out of existence doesn't happen. As he puts it down here, birth, coming into existence, is extinguished, and destruction, going out of existence, is unknowable. Now, when we looked at other passages, Plato, for example, we were able to click on the Perseus digital library to see the passages. That's not really straightforward to do in the case of the Presocratics, and we have the citation down here. I'll talk about this part of it in a minute, but let's go here. Let's click on this, and we should go to, if it works, here we go. Slow. To the Loeb Classical Library. Now, this is not obviously enough, not the Perseus Digital Library. And one difference is that this library is behind a paywall, unfortunately. The Perseus Digital Library is not. It's open source, and so we can use it. But the reason when we clicked on that link we got here is that ASU allows me to, and any ASU student or faculty member allows us to see, to get access to this library. ASU pays a subscription. And so what we have here is the Greek on one side and then an English translation on the other. Let's go back a page and we'll see the beginning of it. Yeah, so here, right, what we have here in Parmenides is put together from some other sources in which fragments are given. So part of this comes from Plato, part of it comes from Sextus Empiricus, part of it comes from Simplicius. And we could, if we wanted, some of this stuff is in the Perseus Digital Library. Plato's Sophist is there, for example, and so is, actually, I don't think Sextus Empiricus is. So we don't have everything that we need in the Perseus Digital Library. Sometimes we're going to be looking at the Loeb Classical Library as we are in this particular case. Now you can see here we got B7 and B8, and that is going to correspond to an older collection of the pre-Socratic fragments. Let's see if we can find that real quickly. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. Just want to move this around a little bit. There we go. So I want to back. Here we go, back to the lecture notes. And I want to go to some online resources. So if we go to the table of contents, we see we have some online resources. So if we click there, we can see now this page is not complete, but we can see here, we can click on this in German, the fragments of the Presocratics, and that's what the text was referring to. Let's see if I can get both on the screen at once. Well, I probably can't. Let's just go here. So if we click on this, we can see another library. This one is open source for the most part, at least some of the stuff. And what we have here is this older collection by Diels and Krantz. Oops, wrong way. And see, we have here Parmenides, and he's collecting together the fragments. And so in the passage we had DK 28. So refers to this book, Diels and Krantz, chapter 28. And then you have B fragments, and the B fragments are thought to be words that Parmenides actually uttered. So if we go back to this, we'll see it. DK 28B8. So this refers to the older collection, and they're often referred to still by this older collection, pre-Socratic fragments. But here I give you the ability to see the newer collection. And so here we have this fragment in which Parmenides argues nothing comes into and goes out of existence. Now, what's interesting about this, or what's a thing that's interesting about this, is that it's not something we'd ordinarily think. And of course, Parmenides understands that, and he introduces this distinction between reason and experience to explain why we ordinarily think what we do. And we can see this distinction down here, right? He's saying that we should not, right, allow experience to force us to think that things come into and go out of existence. Rather, we should judge by reason. And if we do, we'll see that they don't. Okay. Now, Parmenides doesn't develop this distinction very well, but we can see what he's doing. He's thinking about the thinking that constitutes wisdom. He wants to say that wisdom, the sort of thing that the inquirers into nature are pursuing, is really something we pursue by using reason, not by using experience, this kinds of thinking. And so we have him here being a philosopher in the new philosophical tradition, right? He's talking about wisdom, trying to understand what it is and how we get it. And then we can, against this background, we can see that there's a criticism he's going to make of the Malaysians, but you can look at that in the lecture notes. What I want to do now is move on to the next philosopher who has this distinction between reason and experience, and that's Democritus. So let's go down and move forward. Now, Democritus, he was born just a few years after Socrates, and it seems that he actually outlived Socrates. And so now we're getting close to the end of the pre-Socratic period. We're almost ready to move on to Socrates, but first let's take a look at Democritus here. Now, he's part of a group of philosophers, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, and Leucippus. Leucippus is usually associated with Democritus. He's a shadowy figure we don't know much about, but usually Leucippus and Democritus are thought to be atomists, and they belong to a group that are called pluralists because they take the nature of reality to consist in a plurality of objects, not just one object like the Malaysian inquirers thought. Okay, so with atomism, it helps to understand what it is by realizing that the English word atom here and what we mean when we say Democritus is an atomist comes from a Greek word that just means uncut. The A here is a privative, as in asymmetrical, for example. Now, we don't realize that in the case of the English word atom unless we have a background in Greek, but we can find the word down at the bottom of the page. Here it is. Looks just like, really, our English word, really, when you transliterate it. Here's the transliteration here. Okay. Now, what Democritus thinks is that the nature of reality consists in atoms moving through the void. And he's with Parmenides to some extent on this point, because the atoms, they don't come into or go out of existence. They don't have parts, so they can't break apart. And they can't, because they don't have parts, they can't have come together, right? And so they just move through the void. And they can make us, if we aren't careful, right, when we're looking at what goes on in the world, we can think that things come into and go out of existence, because when the atoms get close to one another, it can appear to us as if something's coming into existence. And when the atoms move apart from one another, it can appear to us as if something has gone out of existence. But the reality of the matter, according to Democritus, is that no such thing has happened. All that's happened is that atoms have changed their location in the void. And our tendency, so here he's going to be working like Parmenides, our tendency to think otherwise stems from the fact that we're not careful in relying on the right kind of thinking. We rely on experience, and that gives us our belief that things come into and go out of existence. But if we want to know the truth about reality, we've got to follow reason, Democritus says. Okay, so he's standing in the same tradition that we saw with Parmenides. He's trying to understand what wisdom is and how we get it. And we can see a passage in which he's, with this view is attributed to him here. Actually, both. We got a passage here, and we got a passage here. And these are both from a philosopher named Sextus Empiricus. He comes much later in the tradition. In fact, he's outside the period of study in this course, but he's an important source of information about Democritus. And he tells us Democritus distinguishes two kinds of thinking, one bastard, one legitimate. The bastard one somehow is a matter of using our senses. This is going to correspond to experience. And the other is somehow a matter of not doing that and using reason. So once again, the distinction between experience and reason is not developed very much. It's not easy to see just what these philosophers had in mind. In fact, right, there's going to be some question later in the history of philosophy about whether reason really exists, whether there really is this power that these philosophers are attributing to human beings. Sextus Empiricus, he's part of this skepticism about reason. But the rationalism that we've seen in Democritus and before that in Parmenides is going to be the dominant position that comes out of the pre-Socratic period. So we can see really sort of, if we take the big picture, we can see what happened, right? So the inquirers into nature, Thales and his Malaysian counterparts, they pursue a new kind of explanation in the discipline that became known as the inquiry into nature. They were understood as pursuing wisdom, but it wasn't very clear what this wisdom was and how we get it, what kind of thinking we exercise to get wisdom. And these questions, started a conversation in which answers were given. And we've seen the mainstream of answers that we get in Parmenides and in Democritus, which tells us that wisdom is somehow a matter of reason. And this starts the conversation that we call the ancient philosophical tradition that's going to last about 1,000 years.